Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chris Weaver, a humanities professor here at Forsyth Tech and the moderator for today's event. This afternoon's event is a part of Forsyth Tech's partnership with the Pulitzer Center that allows us to bring journalists to campus each spring and fall semester. First, I'd like to invite Kayla Edwards from the Pulitzer Center to speak with you about another aspect of our partnership with the Pulitzer Center. Kayla?
Thank you, Christopher. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kayla Edwards, and I'm the Outreach Assistant at the Pulitzer Center. As Christopher was just saying, the Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism and education organization based in Washington, D.C. We partner with over 30 colleges and universities, including Forsyth Tech, to introduce students to critical issues that our journalist grantees are covering. I do want to tell you about a very special opportunity that all Forsyth Tech students have the opportunity to apply for. They're eligible for our annual reporting fellowship offered through the college. The selected reporting fellow will have the opportunity to pursue their own reporting project, receive mentorship, and it comes with a reporting stipend. And so this year's info session related to the reporting fellowship will be held on Wednesday, November 17th at 1:00 p.m. I think Christopher has a link that you can learn a little bit more and register for that event. And with the very few minutes that I have left for you today, I do want to show you, we just had our Washington weekend, which is the time when all of the reporting fellows from each of our campus partners come together to share a little bit about their experience in the fellowship and the reporting that they did. So we have a minute. I'm just going to play this video for you all so you can see a little bit what that process was like. So if you give me 1 second to share my screen.
Story can unravel.
Aim high, be resourceful, and also like give yourself grace.
Everyone you meet can help you your story in some way, even if like you're expecting it or not.
Many of the documentaries that I've worked on, have never been the story that I started out with, and it becomes the story that it actually should be.
Well, was originally going to be like a sad story about kidnappings and disappearance to one, I think, about like hope and the humanity of everyone involved.
I didn't write this story in voice that was never heard. We all have created something that will only make the world a better place.
Resonating with people and understanding their stories is obviously the secret to good journalism.
And that's why you write these stories and you tell these stories, because you care and because you want others to care about it as well.
And it actually gives me hope for journalism because we know that it's under attack in many quarters. And it makes me happy to see that there are people who are willing to go out and will tell the stories that need to be told.
If you're doing work that is informing the communities that you're reporting in, while also raising those issues to a larger audience, that's the best journalism you can be doing.
It reminded me just how healing journalism can be just as a human, and to just answer questions you might just have, as a reader, as, a person.
And the reason I was inspired to go into journalism was to try to provide some flesh to those stick figure portrayals of people like me, like my mom.
The story that we decided to tell is about pride and sense of place.
And we've been told while we were reporting there that we have been the first filmmakers to return week after week to the organization to really figure out what the story is and how people feel about their neighborhood.
Do not limit your aspirations to what you think is possible for people of the same background as you, because you can always shatter ceilings.
We often get to know about countries outside the US only in the context of catastrophe. We do exist between catastrophe.
Everybody is just really into what they're doing, and it's a really good thing to see and just be surrounded by journalists who really, really, really care about the things that they're reporting on.
And if you can maintain those relationships over the course of your career, over the course of your work, those will echo and resonate and create new opportunities.
Keep in touch with each other, stay connected. This is just the beginning.
Thank you.
So I hope you guys could hear that okay. And you saw Precious Castillo, who is the 2021 reporting fellow from Forsyth Tech. And so with that, I will turn it back over to Christopher.
Thank you so much, Kayla. I appreciate that. It was great to see you, Precious, in the video. So thanks for sharing. I just want to say a little bit more about that. For any interested students, to be eligible for the fellowship, you have to be 18 or older in the year 2022 and enrolled in at least one semester of the 2021-2022 academic year. The next fellowship deadline will be January the 27th, 2022. So you've got some time just to work on a project and a proposal. So please see one of the links that I posted in the chat box if you'd like more information, and please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you need any assistance at all in deciding on a topic or completing your application. I really am excited to get some good applications this year. It's an amazing opportunity, and I really do hope that you consider applying. So before I introduce today's first speaker, I just wanted to let everybody know that there will be a question and answer session after the presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat box. And I'd be happy to ask as many questions as time allows on your behalf. If you don't yet know how to access the chat box, near the top of your screen, in the middle, there's a little speech bubble. If you click on that, that will open the chat box and you can just type in the bottom and everyone should be able to see it. If you see a particular question that you like, give it a thumbs up. That way I can focus on asking the most popular questions first. And of course, if you'd prefer to ask your question in person, you don't need to type it in the chat box. I will definitely make time for people to ask in-person questions as well. But if you'd rather not ask it in person, feel free to type it in the chat box. I'm happy to take care of that for you. So our first speaker, Justin Cook, is an editorial and commercial photographer based in Durham, North Carolina, but works everywhere. His long-term photographic essays tell stories about communities living along the edges in America, often by focusing on environmental issues and climate change. He believes in storytelling that not only shines a light on these issues, but also investigates solutions that are crucial to social change. His work has been honored by the Magenta Foundation, Photo Lucida, POYI, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Justin, the Society of Professional Journalists, and American Photography, and has been funded by the Puffin Foundation and the Durham Arts Council. When he's not making photographs, you can find him reading about astrophysics, hunting for fossilized shark teeth, and writing in the first person. Welcome, Justin.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me this afternoon. I'm gonna get right into it. Share my screen real quick. Let's see. Can everybody see this okay?
Yes.
Awesome. So this project I'm about to show you is called Tide in Time, and it was supported by the Pulitzer Center, and I've been working on it for 4 years. And it's about the effects of sea level rise and erosion on North Carolina's Outer Banks. And it focuses on a small community cemetery that is located on Hatteras Island. It's slowly washing into the Pamlico Sound. It documents the locals that are trying to preserve the cemetery, the effects of the erosion on the marsh ecosystem around it, and an elderly woman who still wants to be buried there, even if the sea eventually takes her bones. It also investigates a form of climate grief known as solastalgia, which is a sense of homesickness and loss that people feel as climate change and erosion, changes their home and renders it unfamiliar. One thing to kind of preface all of this, recently the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released its 2021 Sixth Assessment Report that says that it's unequivocal that humans are causing climate change. With that in mind, we don't have to look any further than our own state to see these effects. And Outer Banks is like a perfect place to see what's happening right now. There's several human characters in this work, but two of the most important ones that aren't human are the actual land and the sea, which have a symbiotic relationship that is being disrupted by erosion and climate change. In terms of erosion, tourism and overdevelopment are interfering with the natural processes that build and essentially move the islands. The Outer Banks are meant to migrate westward towards mainland North Carolina, kind of like a tank tread. That's sort of how geologists describe it. And the way that works is storm surge from really strong hurricanes and storms typically push sand from the Atlantic beach across the island, building up the marshes behind the island and causing the island to slowly move westward. But that process has been interrupted by Highway 12, which is the only highway that connects these islands. And Dare County has a priority of trying to save these expensive beachfront homes with beach nourishment and building up these sand dunes along the Atlantic coast. If you layer on top of that sea level rise and increasingly violent hurricanes because of climate change, this is exacerbating the erosion and making it worse. You can kind of see here, this is coming into the villages of Rodanthe, Waves, and Salvo down Route 12. And you can see just how close the ocean is to some of the houses. This house is actually called the Black Pearl, and it frequently has water under it. And if you look slightly to the right of it, there's these sand dunes that are really thin, and that area will typically wash out, and you can't actually get down the road anymore during a storm. Sometimes just on a really windy day of a high tide. So in the background, you can kind of see a bridge that they're building across the sound that'll act as a way to get around that when it washes out. Another example of a home that's essentially washing into the ocean on the Atlantic beach. This is up in Nags Head. But what's really remarkable about the Salvo Deus area, which is where there's a cemetery that I've been focusing on is located, is that it reveals the effects of climate change on the land and the ecosystem, but also on people's mental health and sense of home, which is where we get into the idea of solastalgia, which is a word that we've essentially invented in the last 15 years to describe a psychological phenomenon that is new to us, that is being induced by environmental change and specifically climate change. So the Salvo Deus, the Salvo Community Cemetery, is located just inside the Salvo Deus area, which is a recreation area, kind of like a park that's operated by the Cape Hatteras National Seashore, which is part of the National Park Service. And it's located just south of the village of Salvo on your way to Avon. It's essentially a community gathering place for tourists and locals alike. It was once owned by a man and his wife named Little Bannister and Dorotha Midget, which I think are really awesome, like old school Outer Banks names. They owned the land back in the 1800s and sold it off to the Park Service. They actually had a salt harvesting business and a farm there. And they were buried at the cemetery, but all evidence suggests that they have been washed out to sea by the Pamlico Sound, which continues to erode the cemetery. And you can kind of see, I'm gonna go back to this picture actually. You can kind of see in this photo, the old campground at the Salvo Deus area. The top of the frame is the Atlantic Beach. The bottom of the frame is the Pamlico Sound. And if you look at that little fenced-in area, that's the cemetery. And there's like a really thick, marshy, wooded shoreline there. And then here it is in 2017. You can see where there's exposed graves and the sound has washed into it and eroded it significantly. This is some more of the erosion in 2017. You kind of see how they use sandbags to try to mitigate the erosion. A photo like this kind of tells a story where it has like this new young generation represented by this child with this sort of old generation that's being washed away behind them. That's the Pamlico Sound at twilight. One of the main characters in the story is a woman named Jean Hooper, and Jean's 86, and she's lived in Salvo all her life. She's a devout Christian. She doesn't drink. Her potato salad is like legendary in the village of Salvo. It's so good. And her family is buried at the Salvo Community Cemetery, including her parents, her parents and her grandparents and great-grandparents and her husband. And she still wants to be buried there, even if the sea eventually takes her bones, because she has like really intense memories attached to it. And then she has an ancestral connection to that land. It's a place where she used to play as a child. There used to be an island out in the Pamlico Sound that her and her brother used to swim to, but it's long eroded. There was an orchard nearby. They used to pick plums and fruit and play in the trees and all that stuff. But a lot of that stuff is dead now. This is a picture of Jean in the middle back in 1944 with some of her siblings at the Salvo Community Cemetery. And these photographs are some of her most prized possessions. And it actually this image kind of takes on a dual meaning because it was made by a photographer named Saul Lipson. Saul Lipson was working for the Standard Oil Company. And if you're not familiar with Standard Oil was a major oil company that was broken up, and it now consists of Exxon and Chevron and several other smaller companies. They were broken up because of antitrust issues. But they were essentially doing a PR campaign and photographing rural communities to kind of show how oil improved those communities. But what we know now, Standard Oil and a lot of these companies were involved in decades-long propaganda campaigns to kind of convince Americans that we had to rely on fossil fuels to drive our capitalistic economy. So like this picture, precious to her, is also part of this like propaganda campaign by oil companies that have vastly contributed to carbon emissions and climate change. But to Jean, they're so precious that when I first met her, she was keeping them in her family Bible. So, when I make a picture of someone like Jean, it made sense to try to photograph these portraits in a still life, kind of making a portrait of them the same way I photographed her. And that's her beautiful kind of weathered hand with her favorite Bible verse, which is Psalm 23. And Jean's hilarious. When you ask her about, does she worry about having her body sucked out into the Sound? She says, if I was buried there and the water washed me out, I wouldn't know it anyway. So what difference does it make? Might as well be out there, washed all over the place. I can't swim and I wouldn't need to then, which is pure Jean. This is a photograph of her husband, Burtis, who passed away in 2019. He was buried out there next to Jean's maternal grandparents. And that's his fresh grave. You can see a kite surfer out there. It's a really windy area, and it's really popular for kite surfers. This is from left to right, Jenny Creech and Dawn Taylor, two women who grew up on the Outer Banks and have really deep roots to the area. They both have relatives buried in the Salvo Cemetery. Jenny is an interesting character because she knows Dawn because they work together to basically initiate efforts to preserve the cemetery because of how sacred it was to them. And Jenny, to me, is like a very complicated character because she works as a maintenance manager at a vacation rental property company, which by and large, that whole industry is sort of complicit in the erosion that's going on out there. It's like her sense of solastalgia, and Jenny was actually the first person when I was out there talking to people who, when I read her the definition of solastalgia, she was like, that's exactly how I feel. And it's exactly why, I got involved in trying to preserve the cemetery. Her sense of solastalgia is complicated by the fact that she works in this industry that is partly to blame for some of the erosion, which is like really interesting psychologically. And she's not really sure that the Outer Banks is a place she'll be able to live long term, even though it's like the place she's always lived because of what's happening out there. So when I met them, one of the things that I've been kind of struck by photography that covers climate change and hurricanes particularly is people go in and photograph the damage and the wreckage that's left behind. And talking to Jenny and Dawn, like one thing that came up was like how they have these like precious artifacts that like represent their family and their intense family connections to the island. So like I asked them about some of these things and if I could make pictures of them. So instead of photographing the wreckage, here are the things that they would take with them if they had to evacuate that are really precious to them, kind of like Jean's old photos. So these are a bunch of letters that Jenny's dad wrote to her, and some of the ones from her grandmother to her dad, and some letters that he wrote to his old girlfriends. She has a book of Dare County cemeteries that was really important to her because when she really got into genealogy and tracing her lineage through the Outer Banks, she used this as a guide to figure out where her kin were buried. These are some of Dawn's old photographs of her great-grandfather, who was a lighthouse keeper on the coast of North Carolina. This is Dawn's great-grandmother's glasses. She was from the Outer Banks. So again, there's a pretty intense ancestral connection to the land. This is a picture of the cemetery in 2017 and kind of highlights the tension between the tourists and the people who live there. Some tourists just running through the cemetery, which is also like really vulnerable to foot traffic because it's just made of sand, and all the foot traffic, it basically disturbs the cemetery. And these places are very sacred to the people in the Outer Banks. So 2018, they built a bulkhead that is sort of slowing down the erosion, but a bulkhead is sort of a temporary solution, if you will, which could actually increase erosion around the cemetery and into the day-use area, which would actually transform the area into a peninsula. So again, like we can't really always harden structures and build bulkheads or harden shorelines to mitigate the effects of climate change. We did kind of think much bigger than that. One of the things I was thinking about, like when making photos of the story and writing about it, were like, what are some of the early indicators of climate change and sea level rise out there? And one phenomenon that's pretty common out on the Outer Banks is saltwater intrusion, where essentially saltwater from, basically rising sea levels infiltrates the water table and pushes water up and eventually drowns the trees. So this is like an old live oak that's been blown and gnarled by the wind that slowly died from saltwater intrusion. So like I made a portrait of it with some lights, just the same way I would make a picture of Gene Hooper or anyone else out there. Same thing here. You can see the eroding marsh at the edge of the cemetery, at the edge of the day-use area. And this is eroding because it hasn't received any sand from overwash from these hurricanes since the 60s. Because the highway and the houses have prevented that. You can like literally see it eroding away here. Those are the roots from the marsh grass. And as a marsh ecosystem erodes, marshes are like one of the biggest sources of storing carbon, which is carbon sequestration on the planet. They actually lock carbon away. So when you destroy marshes, you destroy a natural carbon store that keeps carbon out of the atmosphere. You also destroy habitat for animals, such as this species of sandpiper, which is known as a willet. And Audubon Society has designated them as climate endangered. Essentially, their habitat is being threatened by climate change. So this is kind of like wildlife at the day-use area. You saw these wide aerial photos I made earlier. Well, you can kind of tell a story by zooming in tightly on the little like periwinkle snails that live on the marsh grass that's disappearing. Again, once their habitat disappears, they go away as well. Do some laughing gulls flying across the sound. And this is a view of the cemetery at the day-use area in October 2019. You can kind of see like the boundaries of Cape Hatteras Natural Seashore that's been preserved over on the right part of the frame, and then like all the development of Salvo kind of encroaching upon it. And this is the Milky Way. I made this photo because one of Gene's fondest memories as a child was going out there at night and having a bonfire and like looking at the Milky Way. And it kind of just seems like a really beautiful place to spend eternity if you were to be buried out there. But the other thing is Pulitzer Center also helped me put together this exhibit where we worked with Photoville, which is a sort of traveling exhibition based in New York City. And we saw this massive banner exhibit on the south-facing fence at the cemetery. And I collaborated with locals to like write about the history of the place and find photographs of their ancestors. And we combined that with some of my writing and some of my photographs. And there's an outdoor installation. It's up. It's going to be up indefinitely. And the joke that I had with some of the locals is that the only thing that will take it down would be a hurricane. So we're pretty dedicated to it. And I told them, like, if we go out there one day and it's just blown off and wrapped around a tree from a storm, then we'll just consider that part of the performance art of the piece. And that's some of the locals standing next to people that they're related to. And that's all I got for my presentation. So I guess Rickey will go next. and I guess we'll have questions afterwards. Not sure how y'all want that to work.
Yeah. Thank you, Justin. Yeah, I'll have you both speak, and then there'll be a question and answer session for you both at the end.
Sweet.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
Our second speaker today, Rickey Ciapha Dennis Jr., was raised in South Carolina and studied print journalism at Winthrop University. He has 5 years of reporting experience and currently covers the city of North Charleston and the religious community for the Post and Courier. Welcome, Rickey.
Hey, Christopher, thank you. I'm so happy to be here and chat with you all a little bit about some of the reporting we've done here at the Post and Courier as it relates to flooding, in this case, particularly how flooding has impacted low-income communities. So I'll get straight into it. The piece was essentially, I guess, a mini project or a deep enterprise, or however you want to call it, that I worked on. It was actually done with a colleague of mine, Stephen Hobbs. As a project, funded by the Pulitzer Center at the Post and Courier. And the story itself was entitled "Flooding Intensifies the Charleston Region's Racial and Wealth Inequities." So the context of the story was actually part of a larger project that we did at the Post and Courier. And it was an ongoing series that we entitled Rising Waters. And basically, essentially what the newspaper wanted to do was to focus an intense amount of effort and reporting dedicated to sea level rise and how flooding was impacting the Charleston region. And if you've been to Charleston, then you essentially know that we're almost underwater almost all of the time. One piece of statistical data that stood out that kind of fueled the project and got us really wanting to dive into a whole series committed to sea level rise was, for one, we just felt like it wasn't getting enough attention from public officials and from the community at large. Essentially, it seemed like one of the only things that people were concerned about was tourism and development. And our point was that, if the peninsula of Charleston is underwater, then none of that essentially matters. So we felt that it wasn't getting enough attention and there wasn't enough dialogue happening locally towards sea level rise and towards flooding. So we wanted to place more attention there. And we actually had learned that in the year of 2019, that Charleston had flooded 1 out of every 5 days that year. So on record, 89 times in 2019, the city had flooded. So that really pushed us to the point where, of course, in collaboration with the Pulitzer Center, we really wanted to dedicate some coverage, dedicating some coverage to flooding and sea level rise. In doing that project, we wanted to kind of break up that series and focus on different themes. And one of those themes was the social justice component. And particularly, we wanted to look at the disproportionate impact that flooding has had on Charleston's low-income and poor communities, because we all know that essentially like anything else, and we even have seen this with the COVID-19 pandemic, that while environmental concerns and flooding impacts everyone who lives in the area where it floods, it does disproportionately impact people with less resources. And just as an example, when it floods, it causes transportation hardships that can lead to loss of work days and even increased health risks for those who have to travel through water that is teeming with E. coli and toxic chemicals. And essentially what that means, of course, is less money in a paycheck for people who are not only can't get to work, but have to spend the money that they have on medical expenses, which further deepens financial insecurity for people who have less income. So we began to pursue that idea, and the result of that was this piece that I worked on. So I'll tell you how it all came together and hope that it provides beneficial for our discussion today. So my colleague had been already talking with some people in a predominantly Black community that is actually a public housing complex called the Gaston Green area in downtown Charleston. And in his conversations with them, he had learned that community was not always public housing, but there actually at one point in time had been a community populated with Black homeowners. So he reached out to the city of Charleston for some documents and began to dig through the newspaper's archives to kind of figure out what happened. And in our research, we kind of learned about this powerful and unfortunate narrative that really served as kind of the shining example of how low-income people have been disproportionately impacted by flooding, and how that condition was actually created intentionally. In the city of Charleston actually had a role in doing that. So what we learned was that in September of 1938, 5 tornadoes hit the city of Charleston, killed 32 people, and left many of the communities in downtown Charleston in ruins. Across the city of Charleston, Black people had already been living in low-lying areas that were flood-prone because they were less desirable, and essentially they were not allowed to live anywhere else. After the tornadoes came through and destroyed many homes and many communities, that even further worsened the housing shortage that already existed for Black people in the city of Charleston. So to address the problem, the mayor at the time sought federal money to build segregated public housing. And what that meant was that the city would clear the land where there were these Black homeowners and demolish those homes and then build public housing in its place. The neighborhood resisted that. There was actually a letter sent by more than 30 homeowners, I think about 37 homeowners from that Black community at the time, who protested that decision. They said, we own our houses. We want to pass these properties on to our children. This is a vibrant Black community. There's nowhere else on the Charleston Peninsula where there exists this population of Black homeowners. We're teachers, we're artists, we're business owners, and we don't want to see our community replaced with segregated public housing. But those concerns fell on deaf ears, and eventually the community of Black homeowners was replaced with segregated public housing, known today, still exists today as the Gaston Green area. Now, the reason why this served as an anchor for our story and really got the ball rolling, because what it did was to show us that this was done intentionally, that the city of Charleston, that the mayor of the city of Charleston made a conscious and an intentional decision to establish a low-income, minority populated community in the area that was flood prone. And that, of course, had a ripple effect, and that's why they're dealing with the issues that they're dealing with today. And it highlights the unfortunate reality. And I spoke with a person who's in my story. His name is Omar Muhammad, and he represents an organization that advocates for these kinds of environmental concerns and advocates for things like affordable housing and so on and so forth for low-income communities in the Charleston area. And he makes the point, when we interviewed him for the story, that oftentimes the concerns from poor communities essentially fall on deaf ears. And if you don't have wealth and if you don't have resources, then it's really difficult to get politicians to advocate and to listen to your concerns. So that's the example that we learned here in this incident here in the city of Charleston. So we fast forward, of course, today. The Gaston Green area, which is downtown, which is in the flood-prone area, they're dealing with these issues essentially every time it floods. We spoke just as an example to a woman. Her name is Jessica Flowers, and she just described her experiences and told us that she couldn't even begin to calculate how much money that she had spent on losses related to water damage. The money that she had to spend at the laundromat to try to salvage the clothes that she had to end up throwing away, the money that she had to spend to stay in a hotel room because the floodwaters prevented her from getting to her home. And there are many others like that. We spoke with individuals who grew up in Gaston Green who just recalled the flooding issues back then. And how the water would even bubble up through the shower drains as they were taking a shower. The water bubbles up through the shower drains as they try to wash. So it's been an ongoing problem. And what's unfortunate is that it's even has the potential to get worse, and probably will get worse because the peninsula of Charleston is continuing to develop, and it kind of ties into Justin's piece there when you talk about how these communities, like whether it's Outer Banks or the city of Charleston, where the sole focus is on tourism, the sole focus is on development, and that those focuses unfortunately can worsen environmental issues for the lower income communities that are on the outskirts. And in this case, for Gaston Green, just several years ago, near where they are, there was a development, a mixed-use development of pricey condos and a Publix store that was developed that the people who live there fear is going to further contribute to their flooding issues, and all that's happening all across the Charleston Peninsula. We broadened the story to not just focus on, of course, on Gaston Green, but to look at several other neighborhoods throughout the Charleston area that are predominantly Black and that are in low-lying areas, to reemphasize the point that these are the communities that often deal with the brunt of these environmental concerns. So, of course, the question is, well, what is the city and what are local leaders doing about it? And they're doing some, but we're not too convinced that enough will be done to really address these folks' concerns. What they have committed and what the city of Charleston has went on record in saying is that they aren't going to, at least there are no plans to demolish Gaston Green and replace it with some, fancy apartments, because that's been a concern for the people who live there for a while. But they have at least acknowledged that these communities haven't gotten the attention, so they're in the process of trying to, invest in some drainage projects that would improve it. And the same is happening in the city of North Charleston and in other areas where this has been an ongoing problem as well. So that's essentially the gist of the piece. So I'll pause there, and hopefully we can get into some more discussion and questions.
Thank you, Rickey. I appreciate it. Let me say this before we get started, and I think I'm going to exercise moderator's privilege because I've got a burning question for you, Rickey, that I have to ask. Before I get there, though, we do have time now for our speakers to take questions. You can add questions in the chat if you'd like me to read them. If you prefer to ask yourself, I'm going to periodically ask if anyone has what I'm going to call in-person questions, for lack of a better way of putting it. So at that time, just unmute yourself when I ask for in-person questions and go ahead and ask. And of course, please remember to remute yourself when you're done asking your question, so we don't have any background interference. And so, Rickey, in your piece, the director of the stormwater management mentioned that they developed a ranking system for trying to prioritize projects, and part of that ranking system includes social and equity impacts of the project. Has that been in place long enough that you're seeing impacts, or is the formula loaded down with so many other factors that social and equity impacts still aren't being addressed? Can you tell us more about how that's gone so far?
Yeah, well, I don't know how it's gone so far, but when we spoke to them at the time, that was still a very new patient. Yeah, you know,
You cut out there a bit, Rickey. I'm sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
All right. Okay. Am I good now? Yeah. So at the time, you know, even with that, when still fairly new. So, and I don't even, you know, I mean, my opinion is that even that was established probably a little too late. To really make up for the amount of impacts and damage that have already been done. You know, I mean, it's something, but I'm not convinced. But like a better one.
I'm hoping this was just on my end, but I was still struggling a little bit. What I think I heard was that in some ways it's too little, too late, and you're still not seeing the impacts of what's happening with the new policy.
Yes. Sorry, I don't know what's going on with my connection.
Yeah.
But yes. Essentially, that's.
That's just the technology we all have to deal with in a pandemic, right? Does anybody else have any in-person questions they'd like to start us off with? Anyone like to unmute themselves and ask?
I'll also jump in, Christopher, with a question. I know Justin and I actually connected about this a little bit earlier, and Rickey in his section kind of pulled in points where he saw Justin's reporting might have overlapped. And I asked Justin a question recently about what are some of those racial tensions that emerge in his reporting and in the story, and maybe even the experiences of people just beyond the coast. If Justin could share a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. I love Rickey's work. It's really powerful. And the thing I'm really drawn to is there's so much overlap between what's happening in the Outer Banks and what's happening in Charleston, even though the communities are very demographically different. The Outer Banks is predominantly white, but there is a class struggle as well, where you have a lot of out-of-town people buying up land and buying up houses and building these really expensive vacation homes, and they don't live there, but they're sort of the entire tax base broken up into these zones goes to pay for beach nourishment, whether people want it or not. But the Outer Banks, in a lot of ways, is a very working class, lower mid income type of place. Like, it's predominantly been a place where the industries are like ferry piloting and fishing and commercial fishing and stuff like that. And a good example is if you go to Avon, and there was a New York Times story about this recently that really kind of rankled my feathers a little bit when I read it, because they were talking about how Avon is this wealthy community, and there's these big houses on the Atlantic, but it's like if you go across the street to the Sound side to Kankakee, it's lower income fishermen and people like that, people who've lived there forever, type people who have family buried in that cemetery. And it's not a wealthy place. Jean Hooper, she lives comfortably, but her husband was a ferry captain all his life, and he worked for the fire department. He was in the Army, and she sold Avon beauty products like around the island. It was like super well known for that. And they live in this like little low slung house that Burtis built himself in two sections. And when you look at it, there's these massive vacation mansions on stilts all around it. And when you stop and look at it, it just tells a whole story about what's happening. And you know, one of the things I just read Rickey and I corresponded via email beforehand, because I just thought it'd be really important for us to collaborate and talk about these overlapping themes. But you know, the political structure of the Outer Banks it's very conservative, it's very Republican. There's one person on the county commissioners who's a Democrat, and that's Danny Couch. And the thing that people don't realize is that the Outer Banks essentially is like a speed bump and it blunts and absorbs the initial impacts of hurricanes, which in turn protects these mainland communities. And one of the biggest takeaways from my reporting and understanding the geography of the area and the racial demographics of the mainland is that the decisions that are made by white politicians and power brokers on Outer Banks can lead to the destruction of the island eventually, because scientists are predicting that the Outer Banks could be inundated by the sea after the end of the century. What does this mean for mainland communities of color? It means destruction. It means cultural erosion. So these decisions that white people are making on the Outer Banks is going to affect people inland. And it's very similar to like what's happening in Charleston in that regard. And we got to talk about that.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You know, one thing people don't realize about the city of Charleston is that the peninsula for a while was predominantly Black. It's predominantly Black, predominantly, working class, African American individuals. And it really wasn't until 1980 or so that you begin to see, that hot button term we like to use, gentrification. And so slowly from 1980 through 2000, you see what was mostly Black community begin to change demographically, and the area and the property values and the rents are increasingly becoming so expensive to where now a lot of those African Americans are either priced out and have to move further north, where you're moving to higher ground. So fortunately, you don't have to deal as much as with the flooding issues, or you have individuals who are passing down the properties, and the children and the grandchildren who want to cash out and make money because they're not living there, are selling the property, to developers who want to come downtown and build a hotel. So that's kind of the historical context, and then you kind of wonder, well, now all of a sudden, because there are all of these fancy apartments and hotels, and because tourism is a big issue here, oh my gosh, we need to make sure we address flooding, because we can't make any money if the area is underwater. But that should have been concerned 50 years ago. So why wasn't it a concern 50 years ago when the Charleston Peninsula was had more African American individuals, where you can draw your own conclusions there, especially when you put in context the history of the city of Charleston and so on and so forth. But that's the reality of what it is, and Christopher, asked about the draining project, prioritization thing. I mean, it's a little too late, because again, as I said, right up the street from where Gas and Green is, there's a massive multi-use complex there, where if flooding was a concern, there could have been ways, whether you use zoning or whether you use other tools to try to control the kind of development that is happening in an area that is already flood prone. Gas and Green is not only a low-lying area, but it's right beside a creek. And then on top of developing a mixed-use complex, they're talking about filling in the creek. And then the argument is that, well, this is actually going to help mitigate the flooding. And we put that in the story. And I don't, I still am trying to, I'm not an engineer, and I'm not a flooding expert, but I'm trying to understand how when you take away green space that is already there, how does that further help, the flooding? But whatever. But again, I mean, these are decisions, that have already been made, that have already been in place. And had there been attention placed upon this issue years ago, maybe we could have seen a different result. So, and in Charleston case, it's the city of Charleston is I think they have a Democratic mayor and historically has been Democratic. But again, we still are where we are. So, I don't think any political party can alleviate themselves of the blame and responsibility.
Yeah, I'm glad you both brought that up on your own, because I was certainly going to ask about it. In this common thread in both of these stories, that people are implementing policies to go to great lengths to preserve one community that's clearly threatening another community. Right. Obviously, these policymakers, I would hope, I don't live in either of these communities, so correct me if I'm wrong. I have to hope, or at least assume, these policymakers aren't saying, well, we just don't care about this other community. What do they say on the record to justify these decisions they're making today that threaten other communities tomorrow? If you're aware.
I mean, the Outer Banks, it's their main economic engine is tourism. So they have to do everything they can to preserve that. I guess it's complicated on Outer Banks because that part of North Carolina has always endured like catastrophic hurricanes, and the idea of anything staying the same down there is just a strange concept, because really the only constant thing there is change. So like they're sort of like used to this, but how are you resilient when this stuff just starts getting worse and worse and worse, and then the decisions are making it worse as well? It was interesting. I talked to Donna Creef. She's like Dare County's planning director. She's excellent. She's like super, just like whip smart, and just a really good resource for this sort of stuff. But I asked her about the idea of resiliency, and she kind of laughed at me. She was like, Dare County's been resilient since like people set foot out here, like since Native Americans, since the first white settlers like settled out here, and people throw that word around like a buzzword. And, she's like, we understand our land better than anyone, but we still have to maintain that economic tourism model. And I'm like, man, that's wild. But like the thing that's interesting is like FEMA came in and redrew the maps for Dare County, the flood zone maps. And they actually, Dare County passed an amendment sort of like low key declaring these maps invalid, because they knew that these areas that they marked as out of the flood zone were going to flood. So like, there's this like really intimate relationship with the land there, but you're asking people to be resilient, more resilient than they're already being resilient. And then when you move further inland, these like lower income, like they're either Native or Hispanic or African American communities who like their whole existence has been one of resiliency, either in the face of environmental degradation or like white supremacy, all that stuff. You're asking them to be more resilient. There's just something really like troubling about that. Yet you're making decisions like that are basically ensuring their destruction of where they live long term. So I don't know. It's a pretty loaded. The idea of resiliency is pretty loaded.
And are you hearing anything, Rickey, from the Charleston leaders about what they're willing to say, at least on the record?
Yeah, well, Matt Fountain, was the stormwater guy. I mean, he at least acknowledged, okay, well, there hasn't been equal investment in all parts of the city across the area. So, that's when he talked about this new rating system and trying to prioritize the project. So he acknowledged it. One of the chairman for the Charleston County Republican Party, African American guy who grew up in Gaston Green. So it was interesting to hear, like when I called him for the story, I mean, explain to him what we were doing. He was like, "Oh my gosh, I've been waiting on this to be written about Gaston Green for the longest." And he's, I think when he got involved into politics some years ago, maybe early 2000s or whatever, like he, was very vocal about the fact that Gaston Green had been flooding and, there had not been any attention there. So he had been sounding that alarm for a long time. So it's kind of interesting, it was interesting, at least to me, to hear, that, there are, Republicans who at least were willing to say that this is an issue. Now what's, the mayor at the time, I mean, this was like the mid 1900s, so he's, dead and gone. So we couldn't, call him up and say, why did you, not listen to these homeowners and, replace their homes with public housing, which is kind of always the story, is like the people who made the decisions are dead and gone. So, you talk to the current leaders and they're kind of like, oh yeah, but it wasn't me. But still though, that's what's interesting, is because, okay, if the city had a role in creating the problem, then does the city not have a role to specifically, create a solution? And that's why I was happy we were able to find that, that letter and kind of, uncover some of this information, because, whether you acknowledge it or not, it happened. So then now what is the city's responsibility, to fix something that you helped cause? And that's kind of the burning question. Right now, the city of Charleston is planning to invest a ton of money into building. And I don't know if anyone on this call has been to Charleston, but if you've been to the Battery, on the peninsula, where they get, a lot of the flooding. The Battery, of course, is where, most of the wealthy houses are. And the city of Charleston is investing a ton of money to essentially raise the wall to keep, the water from coming out of there. Well, yeah, of course they are, because, the rich folks don't want their 4-story mansions, being underwater. But there are a lot of other communities that have, that have long been ignored, and where the city has played a role in contributing to the problem, that could also use some attention.
Great, thank you. We've got some questions from the chat box. Let me see what we have here. Ellen asks, I think both of you did a great job of getting to the personal stories of some of the people in your reporting. And so Ellen wants to know if there's anything else about Gene or any of the other people that you just like to share, any stories, things that you think would be enlightened by knowing about some of your subjects.
Gene, oh man, she's hilarious. Like I really enjoy spending time with her. She kind of reminds me, like, one thing I didn't talk about is my grandfather is essentially from the Outer Banks. He passed away in 2008. This is my mom's dad, but he was from Stumpy Point, which is a little piece of land in the Pamlico Sound on the mainland. But she has a like real thick, high-tide on the Sound side, like, accent. And she's a trip. Like that portrait I made of her, she seemed like she was very comfortable being photographed, and she pulled out these old photos of her when she was a kid. And I remember when it came time to make that portrait, there was a friend of mine, Baxter Miller, who's a photographer in North Carolina. She's phenomenal. She has a house down in Buxton that's been in her family forever. It's like a little teeny tiny, like, Sears house that it's probably been there since like the 30s. She was like assisting me, and she was like helping Gene walk out into the Pamlico Sound, and I had her in position. She just looks at me. She was like, "Make me look sexy." That's like one of my funniest memories of like working with Gene, because like every time I go down there a lot. Like I always try to visit her and spend time with her. But like I think part of what's important to my form of storytelling, because like I wrote like 7,000 words to go with this project and photographed it for 4 years, but it's having these like intimate relationships where in some ways, like a lot of these folks have sort of adopted me into their lives. And like, you know, Jenny, anytime I go down there, she's like, you can stay at her house and like whatever I need. And you get really close to people. And like that real key ingredient is time that you're able to spend with them and seeing the story unfold and seeing it change in ways you weren't anticipating. And Jenny and Dawn and Jean, other people, like they showed me what that story was. Cause like when I first started, I had this idea that I was going to write some sort of like more of a sort of explanatory science type of story, but just the themes that constantly came up. And this is just from like shutting up and like listening to them talk and tell their story, was that the sense of grief. And then it's like kind of digging into that, like it's a common thread amongst all of them, where there's this sense of loss that their home that they're very deeply attached to is changing in ways that they don't expect and is unsustainable. So that's a common thing that they all have in common. I don't know if that answers your question at all. So.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. We have another question from the chat box. Laura asks, what do locals propose as solutions to this issue, since there's resistance in Charleston, so I assume this is for Rickey, to tearing down and replacing Gadsden Green, and tourism is the major economic engine in the Outer Banks. It's for Justin as well.
Yeah, well, again, the good thing is that the city, I actually believe, has been on record in saying that they don't intend to tear down the housing project. So at least it appears that they're committed not doing that, and I think that they're honest in doing that. So folks are happy about that. But what the locals have been doing, as recently, has actually been using the court and using the legal system. And they've actually filed a lawsuit to prevent West Edge Development, who has built the nearby condos, who's trying to fill in the creek. They've actually filed a lawsuit to try to keep them from doing that. So I mean, they're not playing. They're using probably the most powerful and trying to use the legal system to keep folks from doing any more development over in that area. So that's where they are now.
In terms of the Outer Banks, the ironic thing is that tourism is actually part of the solution. It's just reimagining what tourism means for the Outer Banks. So there's this phenomenal scientist in North Carolina, Stanley Riggs. He used to be a professor at East Carolina University, and he's just done extensive research. And he was such a helpful guide for me when I was reporting on this. But he has a book very much about this. And the last chapter of it is about how part of what they need to do on the Outer Banks is let the highway go, because they can't keep moving it. They can't keep rebuilding it. And he has this idea of, he calls it the string of pearls. And the string of pearls is you let the highways go, the highway outside of the villages go, you let the ocean take it, and you preserve it within the villages, and you focus on ecotourism. So you have all these waterways, you have this beautiful sound, you have all these rivers in North Carolina, and you focus, instead of like this unsustainable like beach tourism, like you develop ferries that go between the islands. You heavily invest in that. And you build only in ways that are symbiotic with the geomorphology of the island. So essentially, if you build, you don't build on the Atlantic anymore. You build on the sound side, and you build on really deep lots. And the part of the thing about building on a really deep lot is, as the shoreline naturally recedes, you can move your house back towards the sound. So like the thing is, like we know how to do these things. We're just not doing them. Like there's the book that he has. I have it on my bookshelf right here. Actually, it's like super great. The ferries that we would need already exist. They have them in Seattle. They run them all the time on the Puget Sound, the lakes there. In Europe, they have these massive ferries, and they can run in like really rough waters. So like we just have to start looking around and figure out other models to make this more sustainable. It's just that I think one of the barriers is that some locals would be really resistant to that because the way things are sort of like solidified, the way the economy is now. But I think others desperately want to change things. But you know, listening to Gene talk about the way the Outer Banks used to be, there's actually there's a lot of clues about how they could live more sustainably because they did for a really long time before the highway. You know, they had these small houses that they only built on the sound side. My grandfather told me stories about how at Stumpy Point, they'd have a hurricane and they wake up the next day and their house was turned around the opposite direction. And they just left it that way. But part of the reason their house didn't collapse and didn't flood is because they had these special like doors they would open and the water would go through the front door and out the back. So there's ways to build that are sustainable. You know, you have to elevate. It's a patchwork of things that are going to be determined. A lot of it's going to be determined by the local municipalities there. But overall, they just have to rethink how they do their tourism. And it's possible.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought Riggs up because I wanted to ask about the mention of using Bald Head Island as a model. Is that what you were describing there?
Yes, that was a really simplified way of talking about it.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
And there was a follow-up question then from Laura. What can be done by inlanders to help support the success of these approaches by the local communities that are at risk? Those of us who don't live there, what can we do to help?
Rickey, what do you think?
Go to city council meetings, write letters to the city council. But I mean, that's really the best way. You know, and I guess if you don't live there, you can't. But emailing the council members who live there, calling the council members who live there, and expressing those concerns and standing in solidarity. That's probably been one of the most effective ways. I mean, some of the, you know, at least in North Charleston, it's been, you know, really just getting on council members' nerves and just, you know, constantly bringing up the fact, you know, that, or asking them the question, how would you feel if you lived in my neighborhood and your neighborhood was flooding all of the time and you never saw any drainage projects happening? I mean, what would you feel? So that's, I don't know, and maybe I'm just to too many of these to where I feel like it's the effective solution. But to me, that seems to have been what's been effective, is just trying to, you know, be in touch with the mayors and the city council leaders and just letting them know.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a hard topic, right? There are a lot of sad stories in what you're reporting on. Is there anything that you've learned from your reporting that makes you hopeful that there is support for change, the sort of change that needs to happen? What are you seeing that makes you hopeful or optimistic?
I think for me, it's not really things happening on the Outer Banks. It's more cultural, like at large, like the youth involvement and the climate movement, like gives me a lot of hope. Because like Dare County is going to fix climate change. They can be resilient, they can adapt, and they can do the things at their local level to make sure they're still a barrier island. But they really can't. They can't stop the ocean. I think the thing that gives me hope is that younger people who live on the Outer Banks and then move away are becoming more vocal about what's happening to their home. And I think I'm hoping to see like more intergenerational cooperation between people who are Gen X and people who are baby boomers and millennials and Gen Z to kind of address the same issue, because everyone has their own wisdom, their own understanding of what is possible. I feel like I'm seeing that more, which gives me a lot of hope. Yeah, I don't know if that helps.
You seeing anything, Rickey?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we had a comment. I think we ended our story with a quote. And for those of you who may go into journalism, you shouldn't do that. Our editor has been telling us, like, please, guys, stop ending your stories with quotes. Because it kind of takes away, in her opinion, it takes away the authority of the writer to end it in the way that you want to end it. But we ended a story with a quote, talking to this woman who grew up there, and just asking her, kind of how do you feel now, given all of this is happening and seeing all this development? I mean, what do you think? She said, well, no, I just think that just like the people, the Gaston Creek will rise again. And that's, I don't know, I still get kind of chills when I just think about it, that she just believes, that somehow, some way, their persistence and their continued efforts in advocacy and even this lawsuit. I mean, this lawsuit gave me a great deal of hope that they're not, taking this development lying down, but they're trying to, prevent any more developing around the neighborhood. I mean, so I guess that sort of optimism that's coming from the people who live there gives me hope.
There's a great question in the chat box from Abraham that I want to get to here. For cities like Charleston, where the issues with climate change are deeply involved with generations of deliberate environmental racism, is the land back movement an option for people whose family originally owned the properties where the businesses are, especially communities and islands like Johns Island and other islands like Daniel Island that once were predominantly Black?
Oh my gosh, Justin's right. Y'all are asking great questions. So I'm not familiar with the land back movement. I'm afraid to admit it. So I don't know if anyone wants to clarify. I'm not totally familiar with what that movement is. But I'll speak to what I think might be helpful, and maybe someone can clarify as I'm talking. But yeah, I mean, what we are seeing in the Charleston. Okay, so I mean, for starters, I'll just say this. I mean, in terms of gentrification in downtown Charleston, that's essentially a done deal. Not to be pessimistic, but it kind of is. There's it's too far on gone. The property values are too expensive, rents are too high, and maybe they'll go back down a little bit. In history, if it'll repeat itself, we'll see the reverse effect, because this is kind of happened before in the past, where you have an area gentrify, and then you have what people call white flight, where white people leave when they see Black people moving into an area. So that could happen, but right now it's kind of far gone. But what we are seeing in terms of the city of Charleston is increased efforts to create affordable housing, to provide people in an affordable place to live. And we're seeing more efforts to just provide more education to members of African American communities, which is essentially trying to convince people to not sell their homes. And especially as it relates to the younger generation who inherit a lot of these properties, to keep your land, maintain your land, and not sell your homes. And a lot of the areas in and around Charleston, especially in rural communities, heirs property is a issue for a lot of these places. And essentially what that means is that you have land that has been traditionally African American that is passed down to the next generations without a will. So you have all of these joint heirs or descendants who all are entitled to the land. And sometimes if one person wants to force a deal, they can. It can just become very convoluted. So that is a huge problem, because there's heirs property all around the Charleston area in particular. He's talking about the islands like Johns Island, Daniel Island. It's all over those places. Now, with the islands, there does James Island is pretty much developed, but Johns Island, there still is a chance for the folks who live there, for the African American community, to have a say so and to kind of have some influence into how that area develops. So they still own, the property there, and they can still, advocate to city council leaders for certain zoning policies and guidelines that can help kind of control the kind of growth that happens there, so that you don't see an overdevelopment there and the same old flooding problems and so forth. So I hope that's helpful, Abraham, to your question. But if you want to clarify maybe about the land back movement, I'd be happy to hear.
No pressure, Abraham, but if you wanted to unmute and say something to enlighten us about the land back movement, that would be awesome.
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, so the land back movement is a movement that has been started with indigenous people, and it started with certain communities of color in the United States or in the global South overall that are trying to stop developments happening in predominantly historical communities of color. That starts with gentrification, that does start with environmental racism, and it ties very close into certain leaders like Dr. Ayanna, I think her last name, Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, and certain other individuals who have spoken up and said, if we don't do something about this, this will eventually kill all of us. And the land back movement is essentially saying, well, since you took the land or you tricked us out of the land or you bought the land from us and then sold it for cheaper, we're going to take the land back and do what's right with it. Because in the United States, essentially, when you have land, you have power, you have a say. And so therefore people want their power back. And that's essentially the movement that's going on right now.
Thank you, Abraham. Appreciate that. So I think we've run out of time. Any final words, Rickey, Justin?
I just really appreciate all the great questions.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah,
so,
I enjoyed it.
Yeah. So Kayla, Rickey, Justin, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. It's been a great event. We wish you all the best. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.